Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really setting aside the day-to-day noise, the headlines, and wading directly into something foundational, the architecture of strategic thought itself.
That's right. We've got access to a pretty comprehensive doctrinal framework here. And it's fascinating because it's designed really from the ground up to cultivate intellectual excellence across the military profession.
So it's about transforming how leaders think, from, the very beginning, the cadet level, all the way up to strategic command.
Precisely. And it tackles a core issue right away, something it calls the paradox of AI and command. For years, maybe decades, the focus was all on information superiority.
Right, getting more data, faster feeds, knowing more than the other side.
Exactly. But this framework makes a bold argument. It says, look, in today's world with accelerating tech, hybrid threats everywhere, and AI becoming more capable just having more data, that's not the winning edge anymore.
Okay, let's unpack that distinction right at the start, because that feels really counterintuitive. If having more information isn't the key advantage, what is?
The framework argues the decisive advantage shifts decisively to cognitive superiority.
Cognitive superiority, okay. How does the source material define that specifically?
It's defined very clearly. It's the ability of an organization, so the collective leadership, to, and I'm quoting loosely here, reason, adapt, and learn faster than it can be surprised.
Wow. Faster than it can be surprised. That's quite a standard.
It is. And crucially, this isn't something you can just, buy off the shelf or download. It has to be consciously cultivated, grown, really, through rigorous professional education across an entire career.
That really reframes our mission for this deep dive then. And for you, the listener, we're analyzing this comprehensive institutional framework, how it aims to embed critical thinking CT as a core competency, not just a nice to have, but non-negotiable.
Absolutely. It's seen as a direct strategic imperative right across the PME, the professional military education continuum.
So the core thesis here, the thing holding all this together?
It's pretty stark, yeah. It's that critical thinking isn't some academic luxury anymore. It's a command necessity, full stop.
And the old model, the traditional PME approach.
Well, the framework argues it often prioritized things like rote procedural adherence, the checklist mentality, simple information recall, and that's now seen as fundamentally insufficient.
Insufficient for developing what kind of leaders?
The kind needed for modern warfare, which is defined by ambiguity, rapid change, and often profound moral complexity. You need adaptive, ethically grounded leaders. The old model doesn't reliably produce them at scale.
Okay, so we're not talking about just tweaking the curriculum here and there. This sounds like a call for a systemic overhaul.
It is. The initial framing in the sources introduces what it calls a three-pronged institutional reform. And the key is that these three parts have to happen simultaneously for the shift to actually take hold.
Three synchronized pillars. Got it. What are they?
Okay, so Pillar 1 targets the instructors. Faculty development. This is a big lift. It means shifting instructors away from being sort of the traditional sage on the stage, just delivering content.
Right, the didactic lecturer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And training them instead to become facilitators of disciplined inquiry, using things like Socratic methods, problem-based learning, really guiding the thinking process.
So changing the teacher's role from having all the answers to helping students ask better questions.
Yeah.
That sounds like it could create some serious friction within an established institution.
Oh, absolutely. And the sources acknowledge that. They emphasize you can't just tell instructors, okay, now be Socratic. It doesn't work like that.
So what does the training involve? How do you make that stick, especially with experienced faculty?
It requires deep immersion. We're talking weeks focusing on adult learning theory, cognitive science principles, and critically, training in intellectual humility.
Intellectual humility. For the instructors.
Yes. They have to learn to manage ambiguity, to handle professional dissent constructively in the classroom. Their value shifts, you see. It's less about knowing the right answer and more about knowing how to guide students through the often messy process of finding an answer, especially when that answer isn't neatly laid out in the textbook.
That's a profound shift in identity for an instructor. Okay, that leads us to the second pillar, the second prong of this reform.
Which is curriculum and assessment reform. This naturally follows. If the instructors change, the what and how of learning have to change too.
Makes sense. So out with rote memorization.
Largely, yes. It gets replaced with analytical tasks. Things like complex wargaming, strategic policy analysis, really deep dives into case studies where the answers aren't obvious.
And assessment. How do you grade critical thinking?
That's the crux. The assessment philosophy has to shift radically. You move away from measuring how much content someone can recall and towards evaluating the actual quality and the intellectual resilience of their reasoning.
How do you measure quality of reasoning objectively?
Through things like objective but nuanced assessment rubrics. We can get into the details of those later, but they focus on how the argument is built, not just the final conclusion.
Okay. Faculty development, curriculum, and assessment reform. What's the third prong? You said it might be the hardest.
It probably is. It's changing the institutional culture. This underpins everything else.
How so?
It means fostering an environment, starting right from the top leadership, where disciplined inquiry, reflective practice, and that idea of intellectual humility we mentioned, where these become valued, normalized professional habits.
Normalizing asking tough questions, even challenging assumptions.
Yes, but constructively.
Yeah.
Encouraging a form of professional dissent during the planning and learning phases, while, and this is crucial, maintaining absolute discipline and obedience during execution.
Ah, that's the key distinction. Dissent in planning, obedience in action.
Precisely. It's about building an organization of what the sources call reflective practitioners, people who think critically before acting and learn deeply after acting. That cultural shift is the bedrock.
All right, let's dive into why this is considered such a critical necessity now. We've touched on modern warfare being defined by ambiguity, acceleration, moral complexity. But that compression of the decision cycle by technology AI, data streams, how exactly does that mandate a shift towards reflective thought? It feels like it might push the other way towards faster instinctual reactions.
That's the paradox, isn't it? The sources really highlight this. AI and massive data flows compress decision cycles, sometimes beyond the speed of conscious human reflection. We're flooded with information.
More than ever before.
Right. But the core insight here is, and the source material is quite blunt, possessing more information does not guarantee wiser decisions.
So more data can just mean more noise.
Exactly. If the cognitive filters the ability to discern what matters, to synthesize disparate pieces of information, to judge the reliability of a source under pressure if those filters are weak, more data actually becomes counterproductive. It leads to analysis paralysis or, worse, flawed, snap judgments based on misleading signals.
So the real battlefield has shifted. It's less about the physical space, maybe, and more about the cognitive space. Victory belongs not to the side that computes fastest, but the side that thinks best about the computations.
That's a great way to put it. That need for reflective judgment, the capacity to question your own assumptions while under fire, metaphorically speaking, that's the strategic imperative driving this whole doctrinal evolution.
And you mentioned this isn't just an abstract idea, it's being formally embedded in military doctrine.
Yes, absolutely. For the military we're focusing on here, the requirement for critical thinking is explicitly and implicitly woven into modern doctrine across all services.
Okay, let's ground this. Can you point to specific Indian doctrines mentioned in the sources where CT is formalized?
Sure. The sources state that critical thinking is essentially encoded as the intellectual engine driving mission command.
Mission command, that philosophy of decentralized execution based on commander's intent, right?
Precisely. Both the Joint Doctrine of the Indian Armed Forces from 2017 and the more recent Indian Army Doctrine 2023 place a heavy emphasis on mission command. And that philosophy fundamentally requires subordinates to demonstrate initiative and mental agility.
How so? What's the direct link?
Because mission command demands that subordinates can accurately interpret the commander's intent, the why behind the mission, and then act decisively, often creatively, when the situation inevitably changes from the initial plan. They can't just freeze and wait for new, explicit instructions. That takes cognitive skill.
So interpreting intent isn't just passively understanding, it's an active process of reasoning. Especially when the ground truth diverges from the briefing.
Exactly. A subordinate trained in critical thinking understands the purpose, the higher political or strategic aim, not just the what and how of their specific task. When conditions change dramatically, they don't just default back to the last order given.
They use disciplined thought
To re-evaluate the facts on the ground, reassess the underlying assumptions of the original plan, and then generate a new, locally adaptive course of action that still serves the commander's original intent. That's the key.
So without critical thinking, initiative could just be reckless freelancing.
Precisely. But with critical thinking, initiative becomes calculated, disciplined risk-taking in service of the overall mission. Rigorous thought is what actually operationalizes initiative effectively.
That connection is much clearer now. Are there other doctrinal references?
Yes, the Land Warfare Doctrine, 2018, is also cited. It specifically highlights cognitive readiness as a core leadership attribute.
Cognitive readiness. That sounds like more than just being smart.
It is. It's framed as encompassing intellectual flexibility, ethical robustness, the ability to think clearly under stress, and maintaining judgment coherence even when flooded with conflicting information or faced with moral dilemmas. All these doctrinal threads weave together. Critical thinking is the tool that enables leaders to act decisively and ethically amidst the fog and friction of war.
And you said earlier this isn't happening in isolation. This reflects a global trend in military thinking.
It does. The sources explicitly cross-reference the U.S. Army's ADP 622 on leadership and NATO's Allied Joint Doctrine. Both stress the same things: reflective judgment, the need to question assumptions, all within that broader philosophy of mission command, or what the Germans termed Auftragtaktik.
So the move is away from rigid top-down control.
Yes, away from overly detailed proceduralism and toward mission-type tactics. There's a growing recognition globally that in fast-paced, complex environments, highly centralized command structures are often too slow, too brittle. You need intellectual autonomy at lower levels, operating within clear bounds of intent and responsibility.
Which means this push for critical thinking isn't just a good idea from the training schools, it's being mandated from the top.
That's confirmed in the sources. There's a clear institutional directive cited from the Indian Army's Training Command, RTRAIN. They've given PME institutions 2 key tasks.
Okay, what are they?
The first is pretty straightforward. Develop officers with an analytical mind, ethical compass, and joint service perspective. That's the output requirement.
Makes sense. And the second task?
The second task directly addresses that faculty challenge we discussed earlier. The mandate is to train thinking instructors, not merely teaching instructors.
So RTREC is explicitly ordering that shift in the faculty's role.
Yes. It's an acknowledgement that the entire ecosystem, the culture, the curriculum, and the instructors has to be transformed together. You can't just change one part. This intellectual upgrade is being driven institutionally from the highest levels of training command.
I keep coming back to that tension, though. You encourage critical thinking, even professional dissent in planning. But militaries rely on obedience, on hierarchy, especially in a crisis. How does the framework practically manage that tension without undermining the chain of command when it matters most?
That's a fundamental challenge, and the framework addresses it by drawing very clear lines. Critical thinking, as taught here, is not licensed insubordination. It's disciplined inquiry.
Disciplined inquiry. Meaning?
Meaning in the learning environment, the classroom, the planning cell, the war game simulation dissent, challenging assumptions, finding flaws in the proposed plan. That's not just allowed, it's mandatory. You are professionally obligated and rewarded for stress testing the analysis.
Okay, so it's encouraged before the decision.
Exactly. But once the commander makes the decision, once the orders are issued, then obedience must be immediate, absolute, and executed with vigor. The training, therefore, has to prepare officers to seamlessly transition between these two modes. Rigorous, critical reflection during planning and analysis, followed by unwavering, disciplined execution during action.
So the idea is you test the plan so rigorously beforehand, precisely so you can trust it implicitly during execution, even when things get tough.
That's the logic. You build confidence in the plan through critique, not by avoiding it. Okay, so we've established why critical thinking is mandated. Now let's look at how it's developed. The framework is very clear. This isn't a one-off course. It has to be a progressive developmental process.
Mapped across the different stages of an officer's career.
Exactly. Mapped across 6 key stages of PME, starting simple and becoming increasingly complex as the officer gains experience and rank. It's designed as an intellectual journey.
Right, let's start at the very beginning then. Stage I, Foundations of Thought. This is at the cadet schools, the initial entry point. How on earth do you instill critical thinking in young people who are simultaneously learning the absolute necessity of discipline, drills, and following orders without question? Isn't there a conflict?
It's definitely a challenge. The framework calls it harmonizing discipline with curiosity. The cognitive focus at this stage isn't on complex strategic analysis yet. It's much more foundational. It's about instilling basic intellectual hygiene.
Intellectual hygiene, what does that involve, practically speaking?
It focuses on building 3 core intellectual habits. First, accurate observation.
Okay, just noticing things.
More than just noticing. It's about consciously distinguishing between the raw sensory input, what you actually see or hear, and your interpretation of it, the meaning you assign, or the judgment you make about it. Cadets are trained to see what is actually there before jumping to conclusions about what it means, separating fact from inference.
That sounds simple, but probably quite hard to do consistently under pressure.
Okay, accurate observation. What's second?
Second is honest reasoning. This means cultivating the habit of demanding evidence for claims, both from others and, crucially, from themselves.
So making sure statements are backed up.
Yes. Is this claim supported by specific evidence? What are the underlying assumptions I'm making that I haven't stated? Cadets learn that if you can't articulate your assumptions, your reasoning is fundamentally weak, no matter how confident you sound.
Okay, observation, reasoning. And the third, foundational habit. The third integrates thought back into the hierarchical structure. Respectful inquiry. Learning how to ask clarifying questions, probing questions, even challenging questions, but doing so constructively within the norms of professional military dialogue.
So it's not just what you ask, but how you ask it.
Absolutely. They're explicitly taught framing language. So instead of blurting out, that plan won't work because you assumed X, which is confrontational,
Right.
a cadet is trained to phrase it as, Sir Man, could you help me understand the evidence supporting the assumption that the adversary will react in Y way? It maintains respect while still getting at the analytical substance.
So, embedding the habit of questioning, but respectfully. Is there anything else at this early stage?
Yes, a really important piece, establishing the early habit of reflection.
Reflection. For cadets, how?
Through simple, repeatable practices. Things like mandatory end-of-day notes, maybe just a few sentences on what happened, what I thought, what I learned, or quick micro-reflections after a training exercise.
The goal isn't deep analysis yet.
No, the goal is to build the muscle of reflection, to start converting raw experience, even small tactical drills, into considered judgment. The idea is this habit compounds over time. Frequent, small reflections build durable habits of mind long before they face really high-stakes decisions.
Okay, that makes sense. Building the foundation. Let's move to stage 2.
Doctrine and judgment.
This is at the service academies, like the National Defense Academy. The officer is moving from just following rules to applying them.
Right. The cognitive shift here is quite significant. They transition from the pure habit of obedience learned in stage 1 towards the discipline of truly understanding intent.
Understanding the why behind the order, not just the what.
Exactly. They internalize that disciplined thought isn't the opposite of obedience. It's actually the tool that enables effective action under mission command. They learn that if they don't understand the commander's intent, they can't deviate intelligently and productively when the situation inevitably demands it.
So the focus shifts from just memorizing doctrine to
What?
critiquing it,
Yeah.
applying it.
Applying it, analyzing it, understanding its limitations. The pedagogy gets more sophisticated. They use intensive case walkthroughs.
How do those work?
They take a historical operation, or maybe a complex simulation, and meticulously map it out. What facts were known to the commander at the time? What assumptions did they make, explicitly or implicitly? What were the consequences of those assumptions on how they applied doctrinal principles?
And if something went wrong in the case study?
They have to dissect why. Was the doctrine itself flawed for that situation? Or was the commander's application of the doctrine based on poor assumptions or faulty reasoning? It forces them to engage with doctrine as a thinking tool, not just a rule book.
I imagine this is where things like wargaming and red teaming start to play a bigger role.
Absolutely. They employ peer debate and red teaming using complex wargame injects. For instance, one student group develops a tactical plan, and another group acts as the red team, specifically tasked with devising the most challenging, perhaps unconventional enemy countermove.
Forcing them to anticipate and critique their own plan's vulnerabilities.
Exactly, before they even present it. And crucially, this stage also introduces the formal analysis of complex moral dilemmas, things related to rules of engagement, civilian protection, command responsibility when things go wrong. It's the beginning of structured, professional, ethical reasoning tied directly to operational realities.
Okay, building blocks in place. Now stage 3. Applied analysis. This is the junior and senior command courses, JCC, SCC. Officers are now likely commanding units. The focus shifts to tactical decision-making under pressure.
Yes. At this level, CT is rigorously aligned with two frameworks: Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive skills and the core principles of mission command.
Bloom's taxonomy, moving up the ladder from basic knowledge to higher order thinking.
Precisely. Officers are explicitly pushed beyond just knowledge and comprehension. They move through application and analysis, up towards evaluation, judging the value of information or plans, and even into creation, synthesizing knowledge to develop novel, adaptive solutions for problems they haven't encountered before.
So the focus is squarely on tactical and operational reasoning, but under conditions of real uncertainty.
That's right. And aligning it with mission command means emphasizing trust, disciplined initiative, and understanding intent as the enablers of that higher order thinking in action.
How do they facilitate that jump to evaluation and creation? What specific pedagogical tools become central here?
The curriculum relies on more immersive and challenging tools. Socratic dialogue becomes much more intensive. Instructors use it relentlessly to probe the reasoning behind proposed tactical solutions. The case method is used to dissect historical operations where commanders failed, often due to cognitive biases, flawed assumptions, or a failure to adapt, not just bad luck or enemy action.
So really digging into the thinking behind past failures and successes.
Yes, asking questions like, given only what that commander knew at that moment, what unstated assumptions were embedded in their decision? Were those assumptions reasonable given the intelligence picture then? It forces empathy and avoids hindsight bias.
And wargaming. Does that evolve too?
It becomes much more sophisticated. Wargaming and red teaming now often simulate complex joint environment scenarios. The officer isn't just asked to develop a plan, or even the best plan. They're often tasked with anticipating every plausible enemy course of action, and specifically identifying the most dangerous one, even if it seems low probability.
Stress testing for analytical robustness, not just efficiency.
Exactly. Building resilience against surprise. And this is where reflective journaling transitions from a simple habit to a core tool for developing metacognition.
Metacognition, thinking about your own thinking. How is journaling used for that?
It becomes more structured and mandatory. Officers are required to document their decision rationales, especially for decisions made under pressure with incomplete information or that involve significant risk.
It's not just a diary of events.
No, absolutely not. It's a structured analytical tool. They have to document. What facts did I prioritize? Why? What assumptions did I make or dismiss? What were the potential second-order effects I considered? And crucially, when the outcome differed from my plan, what does that tell me about my reasoning process?
So it institutionalizes self-critique and learning from mistakes or even near misses.
Precisely. It allows the officer and their mentors to diagnose and correct potentially flawed cognitive patterns before those patterns lead to catastrophic failure in a real operation. The whole model really positions critical thinking as this dynamic engine for command, constantly oscillating between structured analysis and adaptive intuition.
That progressive structure from basic observation to understanding intent to deep reflection on decision-making really shows the deliberate career-long investment needed to build that kind of cognitive edge.
Exactly. And that developmental path naturally leads us to stage 4, operational art. This stage is primarily associated with the Defense Services Staff College, or DSSC. This is a major intellectual transition point.
How so? What's the shift here?
Officers are moving from primarily leading tactical formations, like battalions, to planning and coordinating complex, often joint operations at the staff level. DSSC is seen as the intellectual bridge linking tactical actions to broader strategic objectives. This is where operational art, that cognitive link, is really formalized.
So critical thinking itself gets formalized into a more structured system for tackling these bigger, more complex problems.
It does. The sources outline a specific DSSC critical thinking framework. It's presented as a repeatable 4-stage iterative cycle. It's explicitly designed for staff-level analysis and making sound judgments under conditions of high uncertainty and complexity.
Okay, a 4-stage iterative cycle. What are the stages?
The cycle is comprehend, analyze, reflect, and apply. And it's crucial that it's seen as a cycle, not a linear checklist. You constantly loop back as new information comes in or the situation changes.
All right, let's walk through that cycle. Start with comprehend. What does that involve at the operational level?
Comprehend is the deep dive into context. It's about achieving a thorough understanding of the entire operational environment, the physical space, yes, but also the political landscape, the enemy's likely intentions and capabilities, friendly force constraints, the information environment, the time available. It's also about recognizing the relevant doctrinal principles and, crucially, clearly understanding the higher commander's intent. The core question here is, what is the actual problem we are being asked to solve? Not just the stated task, but the underlying strategic goal.
Okay, so deep context setting. Then comes analyze. What happens here?
This is where the staff dissects the complex operational problem into its constituent parts, its key variables. Things like friendly and enemy centers of gravity, decisive points, potential lines of operation, logistical requirements, political constraints, information warfare aspects. And critically, this stage involves rigorously evaluating every underlying assumption being made in the analysis.
Not just listing assumptions, but testing them.
Exactly. The staff team has to justify why they believe a particular assumption, for example. The enemy will commit their reserves at point X, or neutral shipping will avoid the conflict zone, is valid rather than just accepting it as a given. They need to assess the evidence supporting each assumption and, importantly, consider the potential impact if the assumption proves wrong.
Okay, comprehend, analyze, then comes reflect. You highlighted this earlier as a non-procedural step. What makes it distinct in this DSSC cycle?
Reflect is the crucial pause for self-awareness and ethical grounding before jumping to solutions. It involves, according to the sources, 3 mandatory actions for the staff during planning.
What are they?
First, consciously examining potential cognitive biases. Is our analysis suffering from groupthink because we all agree too easily? Are we falling victim to confirmation bias, only seeing intelligence that fits our preferred plan? Are we anchored to an initial assessment that might now be outdated?
So, actively hunting for biases in their own thinking. What's second?
Second is explicitly assessing the moral and ethical implications of the potential courses of action being considered. What are the risks to civilians? How does this align with laws of armed conflict and rules of engagement? Does the plan uphold principles of legitimacy and proportionality? This isn't an afterthought, it's integrated into the analysis.
And the third part of reflection.
Third is fostering genuine self-awareness of the decision-making process itself, often through structured discussion or reflective writing prompts within the planning cycle. How did we arrive at this conclusion? What alternatives did we consider and discard, and why? This ethical and metacognitive pause is what fundamentally separates this framework from just being a mechanical, step-by-step planning procedure. It aims to ensure judgment remains sound, principled, and adaptive, especially when dealing with ambiguity and risk.
Okay, comprehend, analyze, reflect. And the final stage is apply.
Apply is where the rubber meets the road. It involves formulating adaptive courses of action, often multiple options for the commander, that are clearly guided by the higher intent established in the comprehend phase. It also includes planning for execution, synchronization across joint forces, and considering potential branches and sequels to the main plan.
And this whole 4-stage cycle doesn't happen in a vacuum.
No, the sources emphasize it's reinforced by 3 institutional pillars at DSSC: strong doctrinal instruction providing the common language and concepts, expert faculty capable of guiding this thinking process, and rigorous peer learning where officers constantly challenge and refine each other's analysis.
Let's talk about that faculty role again. The sources called the faculty the decisive point in making this critical thinking culture actually work. How do they ensure these instructors, who are often experienced senior officers but maybe not trained educators, can effectively facilitate this kind of deep critical inquiry rather than just lecturing about their own experiences?
That's a critical implementation challenge. The answer provided in the framework is to give the faculty a structured, repeatable methodology for guiding discussions. The sources outline something called the 5-step CTQ, critical thinking quality, facilitation cycle.
CTQ facilitation cycle.
Yeah.
Okay. It sounds like a system to make sure those seminar discussions or planning exercises are consistently rigorous and developmental.
Exactly. It essentially formalizes what truly skilled facilitators do intuitively, making it trainable and ensuring a baseline level of quality in pushing students' thinking.
Can we walk through those 5 steps, maybe using a quick hypothetical? Let's say a student planning group, a syndicate, proposes a course of action for an operational problem, maybe one based heavily on a past success.
Okay, good scenario. The syndicate presents their plan. The instructor, acting as facilitator, initiates the CTQ cycle. Step 1. Frame the question. The instructor anchors the discussion on a specific critical point. So in your scenario, the plan relies heavily on tactics from a previous, maybe simpler conflict. Let's call it Operation Thunderbolt. The instructor might start with, "Okay, team, thank you. The objective is X." This plan clearly draws lessons from Operation Thunderbolt back in 2012. What specific critical assumption about the current enemy or environment borrowed from Thunderbolt are we potentially most vulnerable on? They focus the inquiry.
Okay, sets the stage. Step 2.
Step 2. Probe for reasoning depth. The instructor pushes past superficial answers. If a student says, well, the technology is different now, the instructor probes deeper. Okay, how is the technology different? And more importantly, why does that specific difference potentially invalidate the core tactical concept we borrowed from Thunderbolt? What's the second order effect on our plan's feasibility? Show me the reasoning.
Demanding the why behind the what. Got it.
Yeah.
Step 3.
Step 3. Challenge perspectives. This is where the instructor actively introduces friction to test the analysis. They might use counterfactuals, play devil's advocate, or introduce red team thinking. To challenge the reliance on the Operation Thunderbolt precedent, the instructor could ask, all right, let's assume for a moment the opposing commander knows the Thunderbolt playbook by heart and anticipates us using it. What's the single most effective asymmetric counter move they could make at our point of main effort? And how does our current plan mitigate that specific threat?
Forcing them to think like the adversary and stress test their own assumptions makes sense. What's step 4?
Step 4. Connect insights back to doctrine. After the group wrestles with the challenge, maybe identifies a key vulnerability or a flawed assumption, the instructor doesn't just leave it there. They link the specific insight back to broader established principles. Okay, so we've identified that assuming predictable enemy behavior based on Thunderbolt was a weak point. This directly relates to the doctrinal principle of anticipating uncertainty, or perhaps asymmetric threats. How should we revise the plan to better reflect those principles? It grounds the learning in the formal body of knowledge.
Reinforces the connection between the specific problem and the general principle.
Okay.
Okay, and the final step.
Step 5. Reflect and consolidate the learning. The instructor guides a brief reflection, summarizing not just the outcome, okay, we need to change the plan, but the process and the broader lesson learned. So what was the key takeaway from this specific discussion? Perhaps it's the danger of pattern recognition based on past success without rigorously testing for present differences. The lesson isn't just about Thunderbolt, it's about the critical habit of always identifying and pressure testing the weakest assumption in any plan.
By using that structured 5-step cycle consistently, you ensure that every seminar, every planning exercise actively pushes officers up Bloom's taxonomy towards critical evaluation and potentially creative synthesis, rather than just settling for the first plausible answer.
That's the goal, and achieving that goal necessitates the final institutional reform piece in this section. A complete overhaul of the assessment philosophy. We touched on it. Assessment has to shift from measuring memory to measuring the quality of thought.
Right, but how do you do that fairly, consistently, across potentially hundreds of officers? It sounds difficult to standardize.
It is challenging, but the framework proposes concrete methods. Primarily, systematically replacing traditional multiple choice or recall-based exams with performance-based assessments.
Such as?
Things like reflective essays, where the grade depends heavily on the justification and logical coherence of the argument, not just the conclusion. Detailed policy analyses requiring officers to dissect a complex issue, weigh competing factors, and propose and defend a course of action. And importantly, graded performance during complex strategic simulations or war games, where their decisions and rationales are evaluated in real time or in after-action reviews.
But grading essays and simulation performance can be subjective. How do they ensure fairness and consistency?
The key instrument here is the mandatory and consistent use of detailed assessment rubrics.
Rubrics, like grading checklists.
More than checklists. Well-designed rubrics provide clear, explicit, and transparent criteria for evaluating the quality of the reasoning itself across different dimensions. This allows instructors to provide specific, actionable feedback and help standardize grading, even for complex tasks.
What kind of dimensions would these rubrics typically assess?
The sources suggest several common dimensions. For instance, clarity. Is the argument logically structured? Is the language precise and unambiguous? Use of evidence. Are claims supported by relevant, credible facts or data? Is the evidence interpreted correctly, or are there logical leaps? Doctrinal integration. Is the analysis grounded in relevant doctrine? If the proposed solution deviates from doctrine, is that deviation explicitly justified based on the unique circumstances?
Okay. Clarity, evidence, doctrine. You also mentioned ethical awareness earlier. How can a rubric objectively assess something like ethics in, say, a policy analysis paper? That sounds tricky.
It's definitely nuanced. It's not about grading whether the instructor agrees with the officer's specific moral stance. Instead, the rubric assesses the intellectual rigor of the ethical consideration itself.
How? What does that look like on the rubric?
It would assess things like, Did the officer, 1, clearly identify the potential ethical dilemmas or moral hazards inherent in the proposed policy or course of action, for example, risk of collateral damage versus mission necessity? 2, did they articulate the competing values at stake, for example, force protection versus civilian protection? And 3, did they demonstrate how the proposed action attempts to adhere to ethical principles, military codes, and international law, perhaps even explaining how they would mitigate ethical risks? It's about the quality and depth of the ethical reasoning, not the conclusion itself.
I see. So the rubric acts as a diagnostic tool, showing the officer where their ethical analysis might be shallow or missing key considerations.
Exactly. The whole point of this assessment philosophy is to make evaluation a continuation of the learning process. The rubrics provide transparent feedback that helps officers understand their own strengths and weaknesses in critical thinking and ethical reasoning, allowing them to self-correct and improve their judgment over time.
Okay, that detailed look at the DSSC framework and assessment is really helpful. But critical thinking can't just live in the staff college or planning rooms. It has to translate down to the tactical level, to the commanders on the ground facing immediate, high-friction situations. Does the framework address how CT applies differently in specific operational environments?
Yes, it does. It makes the point that CT isn't monolithic. It manifests differently depending on the demands of the specific domain. The doctrinal compendium analyzes 3 distinct high-friction environments, outlining for each: the core cognitive skill required, the specific doctrinal emphasis, and the unique risks if that cognitive skill fails.
Adapting the thinking to the environment makes sense. Let's take the first one, counterinsurgency, CON, and counterterrorism, CT operations. These are often described as the most complex, politically charged, and morally ambiguous. What's the core cognitive skill needed here?
According to the sources, the primary cognitive skill demanded in COINCT is moral restraint and empathy.
Restraint and empathy. Why those specifically?
Because the ultimate objective in CORIN is almost always political, winning the support, or at least the acquiescence, of the population. Therefore, the doctrinal emphasis is firmly placed on population protection, securing legitimacy, and understanding local grievances. Kinetic action against insurgents is necessary, but it's subordinate to the political goal.
So there's a central paradox leaders have to grapple with.
Exactly. The framework teaches it as a core cognitive dilemma. The more effectively you use restraint and empathy to protect the population and gain their trust, the less you actually need to rely on lethal force, because the population starts providing intelligence and denying support to the insurgents. It requires thinking politically at the tactical level.
And if that cognitive skill does it, the moral restraint, the empathy fails. If the commander defaults to purely kinetic solutions,
Then you hit the critical risk identified: over-militarization and the irreversible loss of local trust. Every tactical action has strategic consequences in Quine. An overly aggressive patrol, mistreatment of civilians at a checkpoint, excessive collateral damage. These incidents aren't just tactical errors, they directly undermine the entire campaign's legitimacy and political objectives.
does the framework offer a concrete example of applying this principle effectively?
Yes, it points to the long-running Operation Sadhavana in Jammu and Kashmir as a practical example of this cognitive approach in action.
Sadhavana, that's the Indian Army's Winning Hearts and Minds initiative, right? Civic action, infrastructure projects, medical camps.
Precisely. And it's presented not just as a nice-to-have PR exercise, but as a core operational line of effort, illustrating a cognitive challenge for commanders.
What's the challenge? Isn't it just about allocating resources?
The cognitive challenge is about priority and mindset. A tactical commander might feel pressure from higher HQ, from the media, from recent enemy attacks to focus heavily on kinetic operations. Patrols, searches, cordon, and search ops. But the Klein doctrine, informed by critical reflection on decades of global experience, forces them to understand that investing resources and command attention in Sadhavana-type activities, building a school, running a medical camp, providing skills training, might actually be more decisive in the long run than purely military actions.
So it requires the commander to think strategically about the effects of non-kinetic actions.
Exactly. It demands they convert their tactical presence and security bubble into lasting strategic influence by addressing root causes and building trust. That takes significant cognitive discipline to prioritize potentially slow, resource-intensive civic action over immediate, visible security measures, especially when under pressure.
Okay, that's Ki-O A-Koyen. Let's shift gears completely. Mountain warfare and high-altitude operations. Here, the environment itself, the terrain, the altitude, the weather, becomes a primary adversary. What's the core cognitive skill needed?
In high-altitude environments, the framework identifies the core skill as adaptability in extreme terrain. The physical environment dominates everything.
And the doctrine reflects this.
Yes, the doctrinal emphasis is on managing the incredibly difficult logistics tempo balance. Altitude drastically slows movement, affects human performance, limits equipment effectiveness. Visibility can change in minutes. Resupply is extraordinarily difficult and vulnerable. Friction, Clauser's concept, is magnified exponentially.
So the key risk seems obvious. Trying to fight a plains war in the mountains.
That's exactly the risk highlighted. Attrition through overextension, caused by attempting to apply standard tactics like relying on large formations, heavy equipment, or rapid advances in a vertical, compartmented, and unforgiving environment.
Is there a case study used to illustrate this?
The sources point directly to the hard lessons learned during the Kargil conflict in 1999. Initially, there were significant challenges, with attempts to use conventional frontal assaults against well-defended high-altitude positions, resulting in heavy casualties.
So the critical reflection after those initial setbacks led to adaptation.
Yes. The enduring lesson from Kargil, as presented here, was the tactical innovation born out of necessity. Forces had to rapidly adapt. They developed specialized, decentralized, small-unit assault tactics suited for near-vertical climbs. They had to figure out new ways to coordinate fire support with limited artillery arcs and observation. They learned to use the terrain, not just fight against it.
How did that translate into the specific cognitive task for a commander operating in mountains today? What does adaptability mean in practice?
It means fundamentally reframing how you see the environment. The officer must employ a terrain-as-weapon mindset, both defensively and offensively. They need to critically analyze, how is the enemy using the terrain to their advantage? How can we use micro-terrain features, unexpected approaches, or specialized capabilities, like mountaineering teams, to negate the enemy's advantage or achieve surprise?
So it might mean recognizing that a small, specially trained unit taking a high-risk, unconventional route could achieve a decisive effect that a much larger, conventionally deployed force couldn't.
Precisely. It validates the idea that leadership and adaptability driven by critical thinking about the specific environment can overcome material disadvantages, but only if commanders break free from standard templates and tailor their tactics relentlessly to the unique demands of the terrain.
Okay, Coinetarian demands empathy and political acumen. Mountains demand extreme adaptability. What about the third environment, urban operations, often called the three-block war, combat, peacekeeping, humanitarian aid happening simultaneously?
Urban ops are presented as perhaps the ultimate test of tactical complexity and leadership judgment. The core cognitive skill required is identified as judgment under constraint.
Constraint, meaning legal, ethical, political constraints.
All of the above, plus the sheer physical constraints of the dense, complex, populated urban environment itself. The doctrine emphasizes decentralized command, because central control breaks down, extreme precision in combined arms coordination to minimize collateral damage, and overarching everything, the absolute priority of civil considerations.
Because every building, every street corner holds potential threats, but also civilians.
Exactly. Every intersection can hide an IED, an ambush, or a family trying to shelter. Every engagement carries immense risk of collateral damage, civilian casualties, and damage to critical infrastructure. Ambiguity is constant. Friction is everywhere. The potential for tactical actions to have immediate negative strategic consequences, loss of legitimacy, fueling opposition is incredibly high.
The risk is catastrophic. Massive collateral damage leading to a rapid, often irreversible erosion of legitimacy. So across these vastly different environments, Koyan, mountains, urban locks, how does that higher level concept of operational art, the framework taught at DSSC, still apply? Does the core logic hold?
The sources argue that it does. They use a fascinating contrast between two very different historical operations to demonstrate that the underlying cognitive architecture of operational art, the deliberate process of defining an approach, building a framework, and managing the process, remains constant and essential, even when the mission shifts radically from high-intensity combat to humanitarian assistance.
Okay, which two operations are contrasted?
They contrast Operation Vijay, the military action to liberate Goa in 1961, with Operation Rahat, the non-combatant evacuation operation NEO, conducted in Yemen in 2015.
Fiji and Goa was a combat operation, albeit a short one, in urban areas.
Yes. A combat entry into populated areas like Panaji and Margao, designed to compel a Portuguese surrender with minimum bloodshed. The operational approach was dictated by political aims. Swift action, but with extreme restraint on force application to minimize casualties and damage, securing the political objective quickly. The cognitive discipline required from commanders was immense, constantly balancing the military necessity to advance against the political imperative to show restraint.
Okay, compare that to Operation Rahat in Yemen in 2015. Totally different context.
Completely different. Rahat was a large-scale humanitarian mission, evacuating thousands of Indian citizens and foreign nationals from multiple locations in Yemen amidst a raging civil war under active threat, including airstrikes and ground fighting. It was a non-combatant evacuation operation, NEO, in an extremely high-risk, non-permissive environment.
So how did operational art apply there if it wasn't about combat objectives?
The principles still guided the cognitive process. The operational approach for Rahat linked the humanitarian action directly to demonstrating India's capability and commitment, enhancing national prestige and strategic credibility. The goal was zero casualties among evacuees and minimal risk to Indian forces, requiring meticulous joint and multinational coordination.
And the operational framework.
The framework involved incredibly complex, rapid operational design, identifying secure extraction points like Adenport and Sana'a Airport, establishing and protecting air and sea corridors simultaneously, coordinating with multiple nations and warring factions on the ground, all under extreme time pressure and constant threat. The process involved managing logistics, information flow, and diplomatic negotiations in real time.
So the contrast between Vijay, combat, political restraint, and Rahat, NEO, humanitarian high threat, shows that operational art isn't just a set of tactics for fighting.
Exactly. It shows that operational art is the fundamental cognitive architecture used to translate strategic purpose into coherent action on the ground. It's about framing the problem, designing an approach, building a framework, and managing the process to achieve the desired political end state, whether that end state requires applying force, rescuing civilians, or, as in Quran, building trust. The thinking process remains crucial.
Okay, we've climbed the ladder. Foundational habits for cadets, doctrinal application for junior officers, operational art for staff officers. Now we reach the summit. Strategic cognition. This is the domain of the war colleges, the National Defense College, as NDC. What's the fundamental shift in thinking required at this highest level of PME?
The intellectual task itself undergoes a profound change. At the strategic level, senior leaders are less focused on solving clearly defined tactical or operational problems. Their primary cognitive task becomes framing wickedly complex, often ambiguous strategic problems.
Framing them, meaning defining what the problem actually is.
Precisely. And understanding its multiple dimensions. They're dealing with much longer time horizons, years, decades. They have to anticipate second, third, even fourth order consequences of decisions. And crucially, their work involves integrating military strategy with all the other instruments of national power, diplomatic, informational, economic.
So the thinking moves beyond the purely military domain into the realm of grand strategy and statecraft. From executing plans to defining the very architecture of national security.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the NDC pedagogical architecture is explicitly designed to foster this kind of integrated strategic thinking. It brings together senior military officers with senior civil servants, diplomats, intelligence officials.
Breaking down those traditional bureaucratic silos.
Exactly. The goal is to overcome the cognitive silos that can often plague complex government decision-making, fostering a shared understanding and a common language for tackling national security challenges.
What specific teaching methods are used to cultivate this kind of strategic level, long horizon thinking? It must be different from tactical wargaming.
It is quite different. The methods are broader and more conceptual. They rely heavily on interdisciplinary seminars where participants have to grapple with and synthesize complex ideas from international relations theory, economics, technological forecasting, historical analysis, political science. The readings are dense, the discussions intense.
Beyond seminars.
They engage in long-form strategic simulation exercises, sometimes running over weeks or months. Participants role-play as national leaders, cabinet ministers, heads of international organizations representing different countries or blocs. They have to negotiate, strategize, and manage crises from perspectives often very different from their own professional backgrounds.
Forcing them to argue strategic interests they don't personally hold.
Yes, building cognitive empathy and understanding the constraints and drivers of other actors, both allies and adversaries. And critically, at this level, they employ rigorous policy red teaming.
Red teaming national strategy itself.
Yes. Stress testing proposed national security strategies or major defense policies against challenging counterfactuals, black swan events, or worst-case future scenarios, asking, what if our fundamental assumptions about the global order are wrong? How does this policy hold up then?
Is there still a role for reflection at this level?
Absolutely. The sources mention the use of strategic reflection journals to institutionalize metacognition even at the apex. Senior leaders document the rationale behind long-term strategic choices, the key assumptions underpinning them, and the indicators they'll watch to see if those assumptions remain valid over time.
So the core intellectual task, binding all this together, is what you said earlier, linking military power coherently to political purpose and integrating that military element within the broader framework of comprehensive national power, CNP.
Which brings us directly to what the framework argues is the absolute bedrock principle of all strategy, the timeless principle of purpose.
Purpose, more important than adaptation. Then resources.
The argument presented, drawing heavily on classical strategic theory, is that purpose is the most foundational principle. Things like adaptation or security or economy of effort, while obviously vital, are ultimately derivative. They only become effective or meaningful when they are guided by and serve a clearly defined and understood purpose. Without purpose, adaptation is just aimless reaction, and economy of effort is just saving resources for no particular reason.
What's a classical basis for elevating purpose to this primary position?
It goes straight back to Clausewitz. His famous dictum, war is merely the continuation of policy by other means, is central.
The idea that war must serve political aims.
Precisely. Clausewitz distinguished between the military objective, the zeal, what you aim to achieve on the battlefield, like seizing territory or destroying an enemy force, and the ultimate political aim, the Zweck, the larger strategic or political goal that the military action is intended to achieve. The framework argues, based on Clausewitz, that the Zweck must always dictate the zeal. Military action is meaningless, even counterproductive, if it doesn't serve a clear political purpose.
So if you don't clearly define the political purpose first, any debate about force structure or modernization or how many resources to allocate, it's all happening in an intellectual vacuum.
That's the argument, because you lack the fundamental metric to define success. How do you know if your force structure is right if you haven't defined what political purpose it's supposed to achieve? Strategic clarity must begin and end with a clear articulation of purpose.
This seems incredibly relevant when strategic leaders have to grapple with huge, potentially existential dilemmas. The sources mention the example of the two-front problem often discussed in the Indian context. How does this primacy of purpose help address such a massive challenge?
It provides the essential tool for reframing the problem. If the military, perhaps operating without clear political guidance, defines its purpose simply as being able to fight and win simultaneous full-scale conventional wars on both the Western and Northern fronts, that's essentially setting a maximalist military objective, a zeal.
And the consequences of that definition.
The resulting capability requirements become astronomical. It demands immense resources, potentially exceeding what's realistically available or sustainable, and might even be strategically unachievable regardless of resources. This is the classic danger Clausewitz warned about. Letting the purely military objective, the zeal, inflate and substitute itself for the actual political aim, the Zweck.
So how does applying critical strategic thinking focused on purpose reframe this?
Strategic cognition, as cultivated at the NDC level, forces a return to the fundamental political purpose. Instead of defining the goal as winning simultaneous wars, a military zeal, strategic thinking might reframe the political objectives WEC as, perhaps, achieving comprehensive deterrence across both fronts.
Deterrence, not necessarily outright victory in simultaneous wars. How does that reframing change things?
It changes everything because it dictates vastly different and potentially more realistic and achievable capability requirements. If the primary political purpose is robust deterrence, then the military needs capabilities sufficient to achieve two things. First, convince any potential aggressor that the costs of attacking would be unacceptably high, deterrence by punishment, and second, demonstrate the ability to prevent them from achieving a quick, decisive victory, deterrence by denial.
So the force structure required for comprehensive deterrence might look very different from one designed for winning simultaneous conventional wars.
Absolutely. It creates coherence for defense planning and resource allocation. If the strategic purpose is deterrence tailored to specific threats on specific fronts, resources might shift away from trying to build generic, massed conventional forces suitable for all scenarios and towards more specialized, asymmetric, theater-specific capabilities. For example, instead of maximizing, say, heavy armored divisions optimized for planes warfare on both fronts, a deterrence-focused strategy might prioritize things like robust border infrastructure, specialized high-altitude warfare capabilities, long-range precision strike platforms, missiles, drones, aircraft, resilient C4ISR networks, cyber and electronic warfare tools, and integrated theater commands capable of generating rapid, tailored responses and controlling escalation.
So the clarity of the strategic purpose, deterrence, drives the specific capability choices, ensuring they cohere into an effective and affordable national strategy.
That's the idea. Without that clear, articulated strategic purpose driving the process, the military risks ending up with sort of a wish list of advanced systems driven by individual service preferences, technological trends, or legacy structures, a collection of parts that may not actually fit together into an effective whole or serve the real political needs of the nation within budget constraints. Purpose provides the essential coherence.
Which brings us to the final challenge noted in the source material: the potential issue of strategic ambiguity in national defense policy.
Yes, the framework touches on the challenge posed by the lack, perhaps, of a clearly articulated, publicly available national security strategy or national defense strategy document.
How does that ambiguity create problems if the purpose is clear internally?
Well, ambiguity can create problems on multiple levels. It can confuse potential adversaries about your red lines and resolve, potentially undermining deterrence. It can make it difficult for allies to coordinate effectively. It hinders domestic defense industry planning. And crucially, it can make it very difficult for internal budget planners and military leaders themselves to make consistent long-term decisions about force structure, modernization, and readiness if the overarching strategic purpose isn't clearly and consistently communicated.
So while strategic ambiguity might sometimes be a useful diplomatic tool, if it obscures the fundamental purpose guiding defense policy.
It can lead to incoherence, inefficiency, and ultimately a weaker defense posture. The argument is that strategic leadership, at its core, is defined by the intellectual clarity and courage to define and articulate that national purpose, providing the essential foundation for everything else. Hashtag outro.
Wow, this has been an incredibly thorough journey, really mapping the entire infrastructure of strategic thought, from the cadets' first steps in observation right up to the complex framing work at the NDC. If we had to synthesize all of this vast material, what's the single biggest takeaway for our listeners about cultivating this idea of cognitive superiority?
I think the ultimate takeaway has to be the critical importance of continuity. Critical thinking isn't a destination you arrive at. It's a single, continuous, lifelong intellectual journey. It needs to be nurtured rigorously and progressively at every stage.
From those basic habits of observation and respectful inquiry you mentioned for cadets,
Through the complex analytical design and synthesis demanded of staff officers.
all the way to the ability to frame ambiguous national security problems and define grand strategy at the senior leader level.
Exactly. The ultimate goal, the end state this entire framework is aiming for, is to create a military profession fundamentally defined by reflective practitioners. Leaders who possess the ingrained capacity for sound, ethical, adaptive judgment, especially when faced with the profound uncertainty that characterizes modern conflict and competition.
It really does sound like a profound institutional ambition moving beyond a culture, perhaps focused primarily on compliant execution, towards one that mandates critical reflection and actively cultivates wisdom alongside competence.
And achieving that, even in part, demands more than just institutional programs. It requires a constant personal commitment to self-assessment, really, regardless of your profession or field. Based on the military framework we've just analyzed, genuine critical thinking requires habitually pausing to question the core assumptions that underpin your own work, your own ingrained routines.
Okay, so let's leave our listeners with a final provocative thought to mull over this week, drawing directly from this framework. Here it is. If success in your particular field, your domain, hinges, as it increasingly does, on learning and adapting faster than the pace of change, what specific mechanism could you adopt this week?
Think about it. Could it be something like the officer's structured reflection journal? Or maybe adopting the instructor's challenge phase mindset to deliberately question your own team's conclusions. Or perhaps conducting a policy red team on your own most important project's assumptions.
The core question being, what tool can you use starting now to deliberately question your own professional assumptions and ensure that your actions, your daily work, are truly serving your ultimate purpose, whatever that may be?
Because ultimately, that capacity for sound, ethical, and reflective judgment, that's the essential weapon, isn't it? The indispensable tool for navigating profound uncertainty, not just in war, but in almost any complex human endeavor.
A powerful thought to end on indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.